What if I told you the most horrifying Nazi experiments weren't the ones you've heard about in history class, but the ones they buried, erased, and denied ever existed? These weren't about battlefield tactics or super soldiers. These were experiments on the human soul, on memory, on blood itself. Twisted science pushed to supernatural extremes, all in the name of control. These aren't just lost files, they're warnings. And somehow, a few traces survived. This is Unsolved Archives, where lost cases live on. The snow-covered peaks of the Austrian Alps stood quiet in 1943, their jagged beauty concealing the atrocities that lay hidden within. Deep within these mountains, nestled on a narrow outcrop, sat Castle Hohenwerfen. Known to tourists today as a picturesque medieval fortress, its shadowed halls once bore witness to horrors lost to time. For a brief period during the war, the castle had been commandeered by a rogue Nazi division under the command of Dr. Alaric Marius, a name scrubbed from nearly every official record. Marius was not officially part of the SS Medical Corps, but a favored consultant brought in from Vienna's Psychological Institute. While Joseph Mengele focused on genetics and physical endurance, Marius was obsessed with something far more elusive: psychic connectivity. His theory was simple and terrifying. Identical twins shared more than DNA. They shared thoughts, pain, emotion. And if that invisible link could be isolated, it could be harnessed. The castle was retrofitted for experimentation. Underneath its stone floors, cold metal tables were bolted into dungeons that once imprisoned medieval traitors. The rooms were soundproofed with rubber-lined walls and layered steel doors. Prisoner records were destroyed, but local accounts and a few journal entries suggest at least 28 sets of twins, mostly children aged 5 to 13, were taken from nearby ghettos and orphanages. Twins were separated immediately upon arrival, one kept within the castle, the other transported to a remote cabin nearly 20 kilometers away. Both were subjected to extreme physical and psychological tests. Dr. Marius believed that pain, in particular, would trigger psychic reactions strong enough to be measurable. On one occasion, a child had their hand broken slowly with a steel press while their twin was observed for signs of sympathetic pain. Sometimes, one twin was allowed to sleep while the other was exposed to strobe lights and sirens for hours. In more advanced experiments, one child was drowned under sedation while the other was monitored for changes in heartbeat and brainwaves. The equipment Marius used was state-of-the-art for the time: oscilloscopes, primitive EEG machines, and large reels of magnetic tape. He took obsessive notes, hundreds of pages detailing even the smallest muscle flinch. But no conclusive evidence of psychic linkages emerged. The results were inconsistent. Some children showed panic attacks or spontaneous bleeding when their twin was harmed. Others appeared completely unresponsive. This inconsistency drove Marius deeper into madness. Guards reported that he began speaking to the children not as individuals, but as a collective, calling them the one soul. He claimed he could feel their pain himself, and even referred to dreams where he walked among their minds as if through hallways. His assistants began to disappear. Some were believed to have fled, others may have become test subjects themselves. By late 1944, with the Allies closing in, Marius intensified his efforts. He believed he was on the verge of a breakthrough, a test he called the resonance chamber. In this experiment, 6 sets of twins were placed in connected chambers and given synchronized doses of LSD derivatives synthesized in the castle's crude laboratory. The walls were rigged with amplifiers projecting low-frequency hums. Children screamed until their voices failed. One girl tore out her own eyes. 2 others died of heart failure. The rest were reduced to unresponsive, twitching husks. Then, one night in early 1945, Marius and his work vanished. No bodies were found. The castle was abandoned, booby-trapped, and left for the mountain to reclaim. It wasn't until 1992 that the truth began to surface. A group of hikers discovered a sealed door deep beneath the castle, hidden behind a crumbled stairwell. Inside was a long-forgotten lab, the walls still stained with rust and blood. Steel gurneys with tiny restraints, broken EEG helmets, and boxes of rotted documents filled the room. One locker contained dozens of identical children's shoes. Among the debris, A single journal survived, its pages mold-warped but legible. On one page, written in Marius's hand, were the words, "Pain does not lie. One soul, many mouths. I heard them scream from the mountain. I screamed back." The Austrian government quietly sealed the site and relocated the artifacts to a private archive. The journal has never been released to the public. Rumors persist among local guides that sometimes, in the dead of winter, you can hear faint whispers around the castle, always in pairs. And though the names of the twins were never known, flowers still appear on the mountain path each year in March, left by unknown hands. In the final years of the Third Reich, as German forces began losing ground on multiple fronts, desperation seeped into every crevice of Nazi ideology. Conventional warfare was no longer enough. They sought superhuman soldiers. And so, in the dead forests outside Bremen, hidden beneath a decommissioned airfield, a laboratory codenamed Project Nachtauge, Night Eye, was born. The facility was led by Oberarzt Dieter Roth, a quiet man with credentials in ophthalmology and neurology. But Roth was more alchemist than physician. He believed that the human eye, primitive by nature, could be forced into evolution through artificial adaptation. His hypothesis: if soldiers could see in absolute darkness, without reliance on technology, they would become the perfect instruments of night warfare. His method was radical. At the heart of Nachtauge was the belief that the human eye could be rewired using chemical treatments and biological transplants. Initial experimentation focused on injecting test subjects with compounds derived from the eyes of nocturnal animals, owls, cats, and deep-sea fish. These compounds were mixed with silver nitrate and delivered directly into the pupils using wide-gauge glass syringes. Subjects, mostly taken from local prisons and resistance camps, were held in a dark chamber called Schwarzhall, the Black Hall. They were fed under infrared lighting, kept in pitch blackness for weeks at a time, and deprived of all color stimuli. Psychological deterioration was swift. After only a few days, patients reported seeing glowing shapes, hallucinating people in corners, and crying blood. When these methods failed to produce the desired results, Roth escalated. Transplants began, live extractions of retinal tissue from animals grafted into human eyes using crude surgical tools. In one experiment, a prisoner was given owl retina segments stitched into their own. The surgery, unsanitary and barbaric, left the subject screaming in agony for hours until Roth sedated him with a morphine overdose. The subject survived for 3 more days, during which time Roth claimed the man could read messages painted in ultraviolet ink across the lab walls. At least 87 people were used in the program, though some suggest the number was higher. Not one subject emerged physically improved. Most died from infection or blindness so profound that even daylight caused seizures. Those who survived longer were said to experience night terrors so intense they begged for darkness to be taken from them. One lab assistant noted in a recovered field journal that a subject named K-12 whispered, "The dark is watching me now. I stole its eyes. It wants them back." By 1944, the program faced its own internal collapse. Roth, increasingly paranoid, believed the night had gained consciousness and was using the test subjects to see him. He installed cameras facing mirrors, claiming it was the only way to detect the presence of nocturnals, shadow creatures that visited him during REM sleep. He refused to sleep for more than an hour at a time, dosing himself with stimulants and working by candlelight alone. In early 1945, British air reconnaissance captured imagery of strange heat signatures below the Bremen airfield. A bombing run was ordered, and the entire installation was collapsed. What wasn't destroyed by fire was buried beneath a mountain of twisted steel and earth. All traces of Project Nachtauge were assumed lost forever. Then in 2006, during excavation for a logistics warehouse, construction workers unearthed a tunnel entrance. Authorities sealed it within hours. A private investigative team, working under a military historian's grant, was able to recover partial documents from the site. Among them was a heavily damaged schematic labeled Sehstoff 3, Vision Stage 3, outlining a helmet-like device connected directly to the optic nerves, with ports for fluid exchange and electrode stimulation. More chilling, however, was a set of annotated diagrams showing a child's eye split open, with handwritten notes theorizing that undeveloped visual cortexes may allow full nocturnal dominance. The implication: children had become the new test subjects by the end. To this day, the original entrance has been sealed under a steel cap, labeled as an unstable foundation site. Locals report seeing flashlights flicker out when approaching it, lights dying inexplicably. Some claim to have seen people with silvered eyes watching from the forest just beyond the site's perimeter, disappearing into the trees without a sound. And one final note: among the scattered documents recovered was a blood-smeared index card. Written in barely legible ink were 3 words, underlined twice. They still see. In the shadowed alleys of wartime Prague, where whispers traveled faster than bullets, there were stories of people disappearing without a trace. The occupying forces claimed they were resistance members or political agitators, but the truth was far more grotesque. Beneath the cobbled streets and silent curfews, hidden in the basement of a defunct university medical building, a program known as the blood clock trials unfolded in secrecy. The project was spearheaded by Dr. Emil Hartmann, a hematologist with a background in circadian biology. Hartmann had once been a respected academic in Berlin, publishing papers on blood hormone cycles and their effect on sleep. But as Nazi ideology warped science into a tool of conquest, Hartmann's research took a darker turn. Under SS funding, he began testing whether the biological concept of time, the circadian rhythm, could be artificially reset, or even erased entirely. The Nazis saw potential in his work. A soldier who didn't need to sleep, who could operate without the constraints of day or night, would be a formidable asset. So Hartmann was given what he needed: prisoners, lab space, and complete authority. The trials began modestly enough. Subjects were kept in total isolation, deprived of clocks, sunlight, or any sense of time. Meals were given at random intervals. Sleep was interrupted with lights and alarms. After a week, most test subjects reported severe confusion, unable to tell day from night. Some thought they'd been imprisoned for months, others insisted only a few hours had passed. But Hartmann wasn't satisfied with confusion, he wanted control. He devised a process called the blood corridor. Using a machine of his own design, Hartmann would drain small amounts of blood from test subjects and replace it with specially altered plasma. This plasma was infused with manipulated levels of melatonin, cortisol, and synthesized enzymes intended to mimic hormonal states associated with various times of day. Essentially, Hartmann believed he could trick the body into thinking it was always morning, or always night. As the experiments intensified, so did the side effects. Subjects entered states of manic energy, remaining awake for days before collapsing into near comas. Others fell into endless sleep, unable to be awakened even with electric shock. One particularly disturbing case involved a young woman whose body temperature began cycling every hour, as though her internal clock was spinning out of control. Hartmann recorded everything in meticulous detail. He categorized subjects by how successfully their time could be overridden. He labeled them clock stable, clock erratic, or clock null. The clock nulls, those whose rhythms had been completely destroyed, were the most prized and the most broken. They displayed signs of total temporal disassociation, seeing past events play out in real time, hearing future conversations, or even walking in reverse for hours. In one experiment, Hartmann filled a sealed chamber with dim, flickering light and set a clock null subject inside. He introduced modified blood into the subject's veins every 30 minutes, reversing its hormone cycle each time. After 3 days, the subject began speaking in a flat, mechanical voice, counting backward from 10,000. When asked his name, he answered, "Time is a tunnel, and I'm at the wrong end." By late 1943, the project had evolved into something even darker. Hartmann believed he could not only reset time within the human body, but possibly pause it. The final iteration of his machine, codenamed Chronomodel Z, used powerful centrifuges and pressurized injection systems to infuse blood into the brain at precisely timed intervals. It was designed to place subjects into a suspended cognitive state where thought, heartbeat, and awareness slowed to a crawl. According to a surviving technician's notes, one subject exposed to Chronomodel Z entered such a state, and remained motionless for over 72 hours. His pupils barely moved. His heart rate dropped to 5 beats per minute. When he finally awoke, he claimed he'd lived 30 years inside a black room, and wept uncontrollably for his lost family, none of whom had ever existed. But it was all unsustainable. The plasma formula degraded quickly. Subjects suffered massive organ failure. Several developed severe blood clots that led to gangrene and death. The lab began to smell of iron and rot. Even Hartmann, now visibly gaunt and sleep-deprived, began showing signs of collapse. He kept clocks everywhere, some smashed, others spinning wildly. In the final entry of his journal, dated March 5, 1944, Hartmann wrote, "The blood does not lie. It carries time like a river through veins. But rivers flood. And now, I hear the ticking even when I close my ears." Shortly after, the facility was evacuated under mysterious orders. Soviet troops found the building abandoned weeks later. Inside the basement, they discovered rows of glass vials, filled with dark, viscous liquid, each labeled with a subject's name and a timestamp. Several vials had cracked, their contents smeared across the floor like coagulated oil. The remains of the Chronomodel Z machine were still connected to a reclining chair, now stained dark with dried blood. One officer swore the machine had briefly activated when touched, a faint ticking sound echoing from its core. Today, the university building has been renovated, its basement sealed behind reinforced concrete. But in 1998, a medical student conducting late-night research claimed to hear a faint humming from beneath the floor, a rhythmic pulse, like a heartbeat, measured in seconds. And carved into the base of an old drainpipe near the sealed basement door, nearly invisible unless you're looking closely, are 5 shaky words. Time isn't ours to keep. In the final months of World War II, as the Third Reich stood on the verge of collapse, a secret project known as Operation Steingeist, Stone Ghost, emerged in the Bavarian countryside, far from the crumbling battlefields. The goal was nothing less than a last-ditch grasp at immortality, not through bodies, but through minds. It began at a former monastery-turned-black site near the village of Geisack. The location had long been abandoned by monks and repurposed by the SS as an interrogation center. In 1944, it was cleared out and reassigned under the authority of the Reich Security Main Office, its new mission hidden under layers of classification. The lead scientist was Professor Karl Brecht, a neurologist with ties to the Ahnenerbe, the Nazi institute dedicated to pseudoscientific occult research. Brecht believed that the human consciousness could be mapped, extracted, and stored, a soul reduced to signal. He was influenced by early theories of engram encoding, which postulated that memory and identity could be captured through the manipulation of electrical patterns in the brain. Inspired by experiments conducted in secret Soviet labs, he sought to create a method of recording personality blueprints for ideological transference. In theory, the minds of loyal Nazi thinkers, philosophers, orators, military tacticians, could be preserved digitally and later uploaded or transferred into fresh minds. If Germany fell, the ideas would live on, not as texts but as inhabiting forces. To pursue this, Brecht and his team kidnapped individuals considered ideal vessels and donors. Among the donors were party theorists, propagandists, and convicted war criminals with intimate knowledge of state machinery. The vessels were often young men and women, chosen for physical resilience and mental suggestibility. Many were prisoners of war. Some were volunteers, fanatics promised eternal service to the Reich. The central device used in the experiments was a massive, iron-framed chair surrounded by coils, wires, and mirrors, a grotesque hybrid of electroshock equipment and a confessional booth. Subjects were fitted with custom-designed helmets that pierced the skull slightly, connecting to the frontal cortex. Brecht referred to the process as Geistverschiebung, spirit displacement. Donors were first placed into trance states using audio loops of Hitler's speeches and blinding pulses of light. Once sedated, high-voltage currents were passed through their brains while their brainwaves were recorded on thick reels of magnetic tape. This tape was then inserted into the recipient's headset, and the same process reversed. The theory, electric mimicry of brain activity, could force one identity to overwrite another. Early results were catastrophic. Most recipients suffered seizures and died within minutes. But a handful survived, and their behavior changed in terrifying ways. One such subject, known in records only as V-17, was an English pilot captured during a raid over Hamburg. After the transfer, V-17 awoke speaking fluent German in a voice not his own. He claimed his name was Heinrich Stahl, a minor Nazi philosopher presumed dead since 1942. When questioned, V-17 quoted Stahl's own published essays verbatim, and referenced unpublished material that only Stahl would have known. Over time, V-17 began to deteriorate. His speech patterns fractured. He spoke to himself in two voices, alternating between his former identity and Stahl's. He attacked guards, scribbled Nazi symbols in his own blood, and repeated one phrase endlessly. Two men cannot wear one skin. But the apparent success drove Brecht further. He expanded the operation, attempting to stack personalities, layering multiple ideological minds into one host. The resulting subjects went mad. One ripped out his own eyes, screaming that too many were watching. Another tried to swallow a light bulb to silence the voices inside. A third simply sat motionless for days, only to suddenly declare, "I have seen the architecture of thought, and it is burning." By March 1945, the monastery reeked of chemicals and burning hair. Brecht, now pale and emaciated, had become obsessed with his own mortality. He began testing the transfer process on himself, attempting to graft fragments of various thinkers, Goebbels, Nietzsche, even Plato, into his mind. In his final diary entry, he wrote, "I am no longer singular. I am legion of logic and fire. The shell remains, but the soul is many." When American forces finally liberated the area in late April, they found the site abandoned, the equipment smashed. Dozens of corpses lay in the cells, their faces frozen in expressions of terror or bliss. In one chamber, a soldier discovered an audio tape still turning slowly. Upon playback, it revealed a calm, steady voice reciting the 10 Commandments, followed by violent screaming and silence. One American intelligence officer who examined the site later wrote a classified memo describing a single surviving test subject. The man was found naked, curled in the fetal position in a storage closet, whispering names, none of which matched his own. When asked who he was, he simply replied, "I am not me. I am many." The man disappeared en route to a military hospital. His file was quietly marked unresolved, and Operation Steingeist was buried in the intelligence archives under psychological anomalies. Today, the monastery is privately owned and closed to the public. Paranormal investigators who've trespassed report hearing overlapping voices in empty halls, some quoting Nazi doctrine, others reciting biblical passages in Latin. No photographs of the original equipment survive. Only a single blueprint remains, preserved in a museum vault in Munich. On the top corner of the drawing, written in a trembling hand, are the words, "Truth is not taught. It is installed." In the spring of 1945, as Allied forces approached Berlin and the Reich crumbled under its own monstrous weight, a final, secretive program was enacted deep within the Thuringian forest. This operation was not sanctioned by the military nor entirely understood by the SS. It existed in whispers only, referred to as the Mütter Protocol, Mother Protocol. The facility in question was hidden beneath a remote alpine sanatorium, accessible only by rail and sealed by heavy iron gates. It had once been a convalescent home for elite Nazi officers but was converted in 1943 into a research center for genetic and reproductive experimentation. It was run not by a military doctor, but by a civilian scientist named Dr. Erich Menzel, a pediatric endocrinologist obsessed with human development, specifically the origins of emotion and morality in children. Menzel believed that compassion, empathy, even fear, were all learned behaviors. He argued that if a generation could be raised without exposure to weakness or tenderness, they could become the perfect soldiers of a future Reich. His work was fueled by Nazi ideology, that the human mind could be engineered from birth to serve the state without resistance, remorse, or rebellion. At the center of the Mutter Protocol were the birthing mothers, women selected or abducted based on physical health, racial purity, and fertility. These women were inseminated through artificial means using sperm taken from SS officers, with genetic records kept in meticulous detail. The children born of these unions were not given names. They were assigned numbers and referred to as die Kleinen, the littles. What made Menzel's work uniquely horrifying was what followed. The newborns were immediately separated from their mothers, who were either executed or sterilized. The infants were placed in what Menzel called emotion isolation pods, windowless rooms where caretakers interacted only through mechanical means. No physical touch, no voices, no comfort. Feeding tubes delivered nutrients on strict schedules. Robotic arms administered cleaning and medication. Cameras recorded every second. These children never heard a lullaby, never felt a hand on their skin. Menzel wanted to raise humans devoid of love. By 18 months, signs of neurological degradation were evident. The children did not cry when hungry or sick. Some made no sounds at all. Motor function was delayed. Several refused to move for days at a time. Menzel viewed this not as failure, but success, proof that emotional behavior could be halted with proper isolation. But the true nightmare began with phase 2. At age 2, the surviving children were moved to interaction chambers, where they were introduced to artificial mothers, nurses wearing porcelain masks and trained to deliver only cold, robotic instructions. These nurses were forbidden from speaking unless reciting programming scripts. The children were rewarded for following orders with lights and sounds, never with affection. Disobedience resulted in deafening white noise or bright, searing flashes of light. Over time, many of the children exhibited signs of severe psychosis. Some stared at walls for hours, others mutilated themselves silently. One child, number 14, killed a bird that had accidentally flown into the chamber and methodically removed its eyes, then sat for 2 days cradling the body as though it were a toy. Another, number 9, refused to sleep unless submerged in freezing water. When asked why, the child wrote, "Warmth makes the voices come back." Phase 3 began in January 1945. Menzel now sought to compare his emotionless children to control groups raised by conventional orphan care. To do so, he introduced traditional children into the compound, pairing them with Mütter subjects in play chambers. The results were immediate and disturbing. Within days, several control children were attacked. One had her face bitten. Another was found with pencil shavings embedded in her eyes. The most shocking case involved child number 6, a Mütter subject who had never spoken a word. During an observation session, she calmly approached a control child, whispered something into her ear, then guided her by the hand to a corner. Without resistance, the control child sat down and scratched her own skin raw until she bled out. When asked what was said, number 6 simply replied, "She didn't belong here." By March 1945, the program had begun to collapse. Menzel, increasingly unstable, believed the children were evolving beyond human parameters, that they were perfecting silence. He claimed they could communicate without speaking, forming what he called a neural web of obedience. He halted all further data entry and began speaking directly to the children through loudspeakers, reading from Nazi philosophical texts and whispering strange chants. One recovered note found after the war contained this chilling line: "We did not teach them to love, but they learned to listen. And now they are listening to something else." Then, in April 1945, the facility was suddenly abandoned. When Allied forces arrived 2 weeks later, they found the sanatorium burned from within. Most of the staff had been executed, shot in the head, some with their mouths sewn shut. Menzel's body was never recovered. Of the 86 children recorded in the Mütter files, only 4 were found, locked in a single chamber. They were alive but mute, eyes blank, sitting in a perfect square. One was holding a melted radio. Today, the Mütter Protocol remains one of the least documented atrocities of the Nazi scientific effort. Officially, only fragments survive. One charred report, a photograph of a masked nurse, and a single preserved tape containing hours of white noise interrupted only once, by a faint child's voice whispering, "Are you my mother?" That tape now sits in a Berlin archive, sealed in a soundproof box. No one plays it anymore. Not after what happened in 1997, when a researcher claimed to hear her own mother's voice responding from inside it, even though her mother had been dead for 20 years. Every case adds a new layer of mystery, leaving more questions than answers. Which one lingers in your mind, and what's your take on what really happened?